Okay, hi everyone. We're going to give everyone just a moment to join the webinar and then we'll get started. So please just hang on with us for just a minute. Hey, we're just going to get started here and people can continue to join as we go on. Hi and Happy New Year. I am Andrea Coronado, the Director of Development and Communications for Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. Thank you, Lauren. And I'll be facilitating today's Icebreaker speaker series. We are thrilled to have about 75 registrants joining us today. So during the Q&A, we may need to limit questions to stay within our hour. This is the first Icebreaker session of 2025, and we are trying something new this year. Thanks to our friends at Petoskey Harbor Springs Area Community Foundation, you can now join the watch party in their community room with coffee and donuts. It's a great option for those who are less tech savvy but eager to learn. So for the next 2 sessions, feel free to join us in person at the Community Foundation. This Icebreaker lecture series is free to the community thanks to the generous support of our members and donors, and many of you who are likely with us today, and we can't thank you enough for your support. For anyone who's new to the Watershed Council, we're an environmental nonprofit celebrating nearly 50 years of protecting northern Michigan's lakes, streams, and watersheds. And we work across Antrim, Charlevoix, Sheboygan, and Emmett counties and throughout the Great Lakes Basin to do our work. Just a few notes as we begin. Everyone will be muted when you join to minimize our background noise. If you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function, not the chat function. It's Q&A. We'll address them at the end unless they're time sensitive. If we can't get your question, please feel free to follow up via our website or you can email a staff member. And this webinar is being recorded and we'll be able to share it on our website and YouTube afterwards. At the end of this presentation, you'll receive a brief survey. Your feedback is always appreciated. And if we encounter technical issues along the way, we kindly ask for your patience as we sweat it out. Now I am honored to introduce our speaker today, David Mifsud. David is a senior herpetologist and owner of Herpetological Resource and Management, specializing in amphibian and reptile conservation. With more than 20 years of experience in wildlife biology, wetland ecology, and habitat restoration, David is a recognized expert in his field. David, thank you for joining us, and I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you to share yours.
Awesome, thank you. Can you still see my screen or do you need to reshare?
I think you need to reshare yours.
Okay.
So down at the bottom, there should be a share button.
Yep.
And if you go in your slideshow and do full screen, you should be all set.
You see the full screen yet?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. And then maximize that. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, folks. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat with you today and present. Topic I'm very fond of and love, which is amphibians and reptiles. So first I want to give a little background on the importance of amphibians and reptiles, what species we have, and so on. So context is always important. There is a syndrome called the shifting baseline, and this is so critical when I present for folks to consider and think about, especially it was brought up that we have some of our older folks with us, which I love and appreciate having that. That is critical. It's not just having young folks, but also our more senior communities engaged in these conversations and learning, because the shifting baseline syndrome is the gradual change in accepted norms for the conditions of our natural environment. And if you ask someone in their 50s versus their 70s versus their 20s, their experiences and understanding of our natural world are very different. My mentor and colleague is in his mid-70s, and when he shares with me what landscapes looked like in the 1950s, he says, Dave, it was so different. When I go out doing surveys with him, and we see one or two snakes that I seldom see, I'm giddy, I'm excited, I'm thrilled to encounter this. And he would share with me, Dave, this is a wonderful day. When I was your age, though, we would see 4 different species and 5 or 6 different examples of them. And this is important for us as we think about conservation in the context of what we think may be abundant today may actually truly be rare when you consider what our accepted norms are. And part of what the shifting baseline syndrome is as the environment degrades at local, regional, and global scales, people's accepted thresholds for environmental conditions begin to be lowered. So we have lower expectations of what should be out there. Well, there's always been Japanese bittersweet or a barberry, or there's been bittersweet, or there's always some invasive that was on the landscape. And the reality is that wasn't always the case, that the site has always looked like this, or it's never had this particular species. And in reality, having that historical context is so important. In the absence of past information or experience with historical conditions, each member of our community and new generations accept a situation in which they were raised as being normal. And so having that legacy and knowledge and community of understanding what it was like with indigenous communities, they have 7 generations, and it's about what is it going to look like in the future, but also what does it look like in engaging elders to understand what it was like in the past. So I like to introduce my presentations with this concept of shifting baseline as we think about conservation and what we need to be doing for the future. Right now in Michigan and globally, we are in a time of action, not accepting some of the status quo. We need to be actively engaged in helping protect our ecosystems and our species within them. Michigan has approximately 60 species of herpetofauna, reptiles and amphibians. Uh, they are also the most imperiled group of vertebrates, with amphibians and reptiles in particular. Of the species we have, 60% of them are recognized as species of greatest conservation need in our state. Part of the understanding of these species is also understanding their natural history and the understanding of how they reproduce, how long it takes these animals to reach sexual maturity, and what implications that have on the overall ecosystems. And excuse me, this slide really helps articulate that. This slide shows you the time duration from year 0 through year 17 in a comparison of white-tailed deer versus moose, black bear, and a snapping turtle. You can see that it takes 17 years for a snapping turtle to reach sexual maturity, to be at the point at which it's producing its first clutch of eggs. So it's taking, in northern Michigan, 17 to 20 years for a snapping turtle to reach maturity. And that same time period, a bear has upwards of 25 offspring, a moose 680 offspring, and white-tailed deer over 900 offspring. Quite often, it is assumed that amphibians and reptiles are quick to mature, that they have large reproductive outputs, and the reality is many of these species do not. And even those that have large production of eggs, it takes them years to reach maturity to be able to produce those to replace themselves and their mates. Stepping back a little bit more, especially this is a great time of year to be thinking about this. Michigan was completely glaciated not that long ago. And in geological time, we are but a blink of an eye, if even that, in terms of the non-glaciated context of our state. Everything here is very recent introductions. All the species we have in our state have only been here for a few thousand years. So this is interesting and exciting for me as we talk about, well, that species outside of its known range. Yes, how wonderful is that? That box turtles are migrating and expanding into further parts of northern Michigan, or we never knew it occurred in this particular location. How exciting is that we're learning new things? Not very long ago, nothing was here but ice. It was a biological clean slate. Organisms have slowly, over millennia, migrated into our state and colonized our landscapes. About 14,000 years ago, most of the state was glaciated with fits and starts of glaciation um, receding. And on this slide, you can see ice cover 14,000 years ago starting to have reduction, 9,000 years ago receding out of the lower peninsula, 7,000 years ago um, almost completely out of the UP, and then 4,000 years ago fully non-glaciated. So we're still seeing things like wood turtles migrating easterly in the upper peninsula of Michigan. We're still seeing species colonizing in real time. As I mentioned, we have approximately 60 different species of amphibian and reptile in our state, 18 different species of snake, 11 species of turtle, 2 different species of lizard. Many did not know that we have lizards here in Michigan, 14 different species of frog and toad, and 14 different species of salamander. I have said the term at least multiple times now, or the phrase, that's very much calculated and purposeful. We don't know how many species. As I mentioned, with glaciation and we're still experiencing migration of species, we may very likely have species that still have not been detected that are on the landscape. So it's a great opportunity and importance of some of the things I'm going to talk about later with how folks can contribute observations. But stepping back, why do you care in the first place? Why are herps important? There's a variety of reasons why we identify amphibians and reptiles as being important parts of our ecosystems. They can be used as gauges of environmental health, bioindicators, as well as many of them having a mid-level position on food webs and helping to maintain and keep ecosystem balance. On the drawing, you can see primary producers, primary consumers, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Amphibians and reptiles occupy most of these different, obviously they're not primary producers, but at different stages of their life, they can be everything from the consumed to the consumer. So ultimately ending with a mid-level position, but at any point along that way, they could be the top tier predator, like a snapping turtle or a bullfrog within the relative landscapes, or when they're larvae or eggs, they could be a primary or secondary consumer. They also are important for consuming of invasive species, which we'll talk about in a moment. They have an important ecological role in landscapes. Amphibians and reptiles, collectively, as I mentioned, referred to regionally as herpetofauna, have unique physiological, they're functional, as well as morphological, the physical characteristics to them. They're critical components of both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. Some species are dependent on having both an aquatic and terrestrial life existence, while others will seasonally use some of them. Some are primarily terrestrial, or others, like the mud puppies shown in the bottom photo, are completely aquatic organisms. We've mentioned that they are mid-level position species in food webs and also indicator species because of their aquatic and terrestrial life. They also fill essential roles in maintaining the biodiversity and overall ecosystem function in habitats. Their species richness, their density, the different age classes that we encounter on the landscape, as well as their spatial distribution can all be used as ways to assess the overall ecosystem health and help us as biologists and conservation-minded folks to assess the overall function of a landscape as well as to evaluate restoration activities. As I mentioned just a moment ago, they also are important in helping control exotic species and invasive species. For example, the mud puppy shown here is an active consumer of zebra mussels and round gobies, two very problematic organisms in our aquatic ecosystems. As I mentioned, they are important bioindicators, particularly amphibians, because of the sensitivity of their skin. So they are susceptible to human disturbances and changes in the environment. The more we degrade a landscape, the more amphibians in particular respond to that. Both amphibians and reptiles are bioaccumulators of toxins and contaminants. Snapping turtles in particular are utilized, particularly their eggs are utilized in environmental assessments to determine potential and known contaminants. As these organisms live in environments, they consume food that may be latent with contaminants. Those contaminants go into their fat reserves. When the females are developing their eggs, those fats are released along with those contaminants and can be trapped in the eggs and used to conduct assessments to look at overall contaminant loads in these in the eggs to evaluate how high contaminant loads are in a particular geographic area. Many are also seasonally wetland dependent, some of them being obligate to vernal pools and other aquatic habitats. They have a complex habitat requirement necessitating protection of large blocks of habitat, particularly species like wood turtles, Blanding's turtles, salamanders. Our salamanders require not only just the protection of a vernal pool, but upwards of 1,000 feet around a vernal pool to maintain a population. As we briefly mentioned, they are both aquatic and many are aquatic and terrestrial, having a biphasic life cycle, meaning both an aquatic and terrestrial life cycle. Most rely on the presence of water for at least some life stage. Pictured here is a red-spotted newt or eastern newt, and the top photo is an adult male, and the photo underneath it is a what's called an eft. It's the EFT. That's the juvenile stage. It will go from being an egg to a larvae and then transform into an eft where it will live on land for anywhere from 2 to as many as 7 years before returning to an aquatic life. So this species requires both an aquatic and terrestrial existence and necessitates the presence of high quality mature woods as for part of its life. The species has what's called resource partitioning. They're using different habitats and different ecosystems at different stages of their life and not competing with each other during those life stages. The complex habitat requirements are a fairly common situation for amphibians and reptiles. Some are more generalist. Many have complex seasonal requirements, being both seasonally wetland dependent, necessitating, as I mentioned, protection of large blocks of habitat. It's imperative that when we evaluate connectivity that we're restoring landscapes to meet the needs of a variety of organisms, but utilizing herpetofauna helps create a balanced, overall healthy ecosystem. When you're addressing amphibians and reptiles in your restoration and conservation management efforts, it usually benefits the overall landscape and species around them. When we talk about fragmentation and species connectivity and habitat utilization, the Blanding's turtle is a great example of the importance of those protection of those large mosaics of habitat. Here we have pictured various different aquatic habitats that a Blanding's turtle will utilize throughout the active season. Here we have vernal pools, backwater sloughs, ponds, upland, grassland habitats, river habitats, and marsh communities. When a Blanding's turtle, there it goes, when a Blanding's turtle, and then of course terrestrial habitats, during their active season, these species will utilize all of these different habitats throughout the year. When we manipulate that landscape and change it and integrate a road network, these animals are habitual, living upwards of 95 to 100 years. We're still learning the longevity of these animals because those who have been studying them are now in their 80s, the third generation of researchers studying them going back to the 1960s, and the turtles are outliving the people that are studying them. Thankfully, we hope that Justin will be around for a long time, as well as these turtles, to understand more about their longevity. Because of that longevity and the habitualness of their landscape, when we fragment their habitats, they continue to maintain that same movement patterns. Unfortunately, not all of them are as lucky as this individual was today, and quite often animals are killed on the road. There are several levels of protection that are afforded amphibians and reptiles. The first level is through the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, Fisheries Division, which regulates all amphibians and reptiles. Possession of any amphibian or reptile requires a fishing license. Within that, special concern reptiles, amphibians, and freshwater mussels that are designated as special concern are also afforded protection under the Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Order that protects them from possession, take, harm, and so on. The species that are covered under that include mud puppies, dusky salamanders, two-line salamanders, Fowler's toads, pickerel frogs, Blanding's turtles, queen snakes, Butler's garter snakes, eastern smooth green snakes, and black rat snakes. Several species were upgraded to state threatened last year. Otherwise, this list was much longer. These species are protected as no take and require the possession of a scientific collector's permit to work with them. The next level of protection is the Michigan Endangered Species Act, Part 365 of 1994. And that protects our spotted turtles, box turtles, wood turtles, eastern fox snakes, copperbelly water snakes, Kirtland snakes, eastern Massasauga, six-line race runner, the Blanchard's cricket frog, smallmouth salamanders, marbled salamanders, and the western lesser siren. There is also a degree of federal protection that we have for two species currently, with additional species being federally evaluated right now, which includes the Blandings turtle and wood turtle. They are both now state threatened and are being proposed, or I'm sorry, the wood turtle is state threatened, the Blandings turtle is special concern. Both of those are being evaluated for federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. Currently, the copper-bellied water snake and eastern Massasauga rattlesnake are both protected under that. There are several challenges that face amphibians and reptiles, not only in Michigan, but regionally and nationally and globally. Fragmentation such as seawalls, invasive species like the central photo of Phragmites australis, incompatible management techniques such as use of plastic non-biodegradable or photodegradable plastics as part of restoration or soil stabilization. These products do not break down and become tumbleweeds of plastic that entrap shorebirds, migratory birds, reptiles, and amphibians, and killing them. Pollution and contamination and degradation of our landscapes, subsidized predators such as raccoons, incompatible management techniques such as prescribed fires at the inappropriate times, use of mowing at different times of the year where animals are susceptible, or not using the proper techniques such as a sickle bar style versus a traditional vacuum operated mowing system, illegal collection, contaminants, and road-related mortality due to fragmentation. But there are things that can be done to help mitigate these sorts of impacts. Providing numerous and oversized culverts to mimic the ecosystem's historic hydrologic regimes, as well as providing movement corridors, utilizing wildlife barrier fencing such as silt fence, and incorporating invasive species removals as part of projects, managing lake drawdowns at appropriate timing to prevent harm from animals that are hibernating in the water or in the near shore habitats. In development projects, incorporating what's called Cape Cod or sloped curb styles versus traditional high angled curbs and gutters that impact movement for amphibians and reptiles. All are measures that can be incorporated. When we look at herps on the landscape, we have to think about the impacts of habitat connectivity and fragmentation. As I've mentioned, habitat connectivity is essential for long-term viability of species. The more we fragment these ecosystems, as you've seen, it results in increased mortality. It has a reduction in the overall genetic diversity. If populations are fragmented, they're not able to move between these areas and the genetics decline. It disrupts also metapopulation structure. These are all the different subpopulations and their ability to move genes and animals within those different areas. It increases predation pressure. The more fragmentation you have, the more surface area predators have access to, or a reduction in available habitat, such as reduced nesting areas for turtles, increases the potential for predation. We see in things like in the central photo, increased edge effect. So the woods were removed, that pond is now exposed. That edge now was historically interior woods, now are edge, and the overall landscape shifts accordingly. Reduced habitat quality can result in these components, and as we talked about, reduction or reduces critical zones. Sometimes some communities have what are called buffer zones around wetlands. These are anywhere from 25 to 50-foot setbacks intended to protect the wetlands from contaminants, but also to preserve the ecosystem health and function. Unfortunately, as we described with species that are associated with vernal pools, those critical zones are not necessarily always accounted for, and can require anywhere around upwards of 1,000 feet around a pond's edge, with a buffer zone being anything beyond that 1,000 feet. It results in increased invasive species colonization and many more impacts. So how do we combat that? How do we mitigate and address these sorts of problems? Maintaining connectivity. Knowing the species that you're trying to protect, knowing the landscape and what species occur on there are going to be important things to consider. Incorporating best management practices, including such culverts, corridors, protection of those critical zones, are going to be key in helping maintain connectivity and viability of these habitats. Effective and well planned out site plans and community development plans are critical. I worked with a municipality 25 years ago that had wetland ordinances, tree ordinances, and a master plan that incorporated maintaining connecting corridors between these different habitats. Those same communities now, as development pressures have massively increased in those areas, have been protected because ordinances and management plans were implemented proactively. When we're dealing retroactively, there are also things that can be done. When looking at road projects, you can maintain things like vegetated buffers to block salt spray and other pollutants coming from the roads. You can maintain no-mow zones that allow for riparian species along those road corridors to have critical refugia. I've seen this on projects along I-75. We found box turtles, Blanding's turtles, Butler's garter snakes, eastern fox snakes, all using habitat right on the shoulder, right in those grassy areas along the edges of highways. Leopard frogs and other less rare species as well. So it's important to think about how no-mow zones or grow zones can be instrumental. These can also be areas where, proactively working with the county road commissions could also be opportunities to create and maintain nesting areas for turtle species. Removing curbs and gutters or integrating sloped curbs and gutters to help facilitate movement of animals and reduce road-related incidents is important. Road crossing structures will maintain connectivity, which is critical for these species. Permanent and semi-permanent road wildlife barriers, as well as signage. Seasonal signage has been shown to be very important when looking at these. If they stay up year-round, people stop paying attention to them. We've talked about these examples. Here's some of the impacts. The solution: a rolled curb or no curbs at all, and reduced drains. Here we talk about our different tunnels and fences. In the bottom right corner, you can see traditional culverts, particularly in northern Michigan. Historically, you see undersized culverts. You have the impacts associated with that. Oversizing the culverts, allowing for natural passage of water, as well as creating wildlife crossings and barriers, help facilitate animals moving underground versus trying to climb over the roads. Railroads are traditionally not a thing that are considered, but hugely impactful. They not only fragment our landscapes, but don't have to have a negative impact. We talk about this in our BMP manual, ways to incorporate extra gravel and culverts that will help move critically endangered animals across these different habitats, whereas traditionally they fall into these in between the rails and often die. Here's different examples of wildlife and water culverts showing how they can be beneficial. Structural microhabitat are essential for amphibians and reptiles. It's fundamental when you're considering these species. Nesting sites, hibernacula, which are their overwintering habitats, maintaining woody debris for basking, as well as nesting sites for amphibians, are all important things to consider when looking at restoration. The focus on habitat connectivity and appropriate habitats to support all life stages is important when you're looking at how do we best manage and restore our habitats. Here is an idealized best scenario. If I had all the resources in the world to create habitat for amphibians and reptiles, you have terrestrial basking logs, you have hibernacula such as bee Photo or C indicates rocky structures along the edges of ponds that provide heat sources and refugia, places for animals to hide. You have submerged and emerging logs in and around water. You have nesting areas. You have the river, but you have the both the riverine habitats, the vernal pools, both in wet meadow habitats, open water, as well as terrestrial. And then you have your larger lakes and ponds that all provide critical habitats for the various species we encounter. When you're looking at aquatic habitats, we have to think about structure, function, and even the slopes that are associated with these things. When you look at this gradual gradient in the left-hand photo, you can see these habitats are different species occupy different depths to it. So it's also having that variable topography, but also variable shoreline edging to it. Turtle nesting can take on various forms. Here's a couple projects that we've done in rather urban areas, as well as fields and different situations. You can have simple sandy nesting areas. The importance of these areas is also not only just having these, but where you have high predator areas, considering incorporation of structures that prevent predators from getting into them. Basking logs are a very inexpensive, simple way. The photo on the bottom right corner, within 2 hours of that tree being felled, we had 3 species of turtle that had never been found in this marsh complex basking. And the removal of that tree, we were able to move around some of the sandy soil around it. Now that it was open and sunny, within 2 days, we had two different species of turtle nesting in that area where that tree had previously been. So small impacts. This is removal of a cottonwood tree. This wasn't it was a quick growing tree, lower ecological value, but by removing that tree, it had a high ecological value, creating basking opportunities for turtles. Aquatic habitat is often under considered when we think about our species like salamanders. Here we have a conceptualized drawing as well as an engineering drawing and the actual implementation of it. And these structures were being utilized on a project that we have, and we're actively working with Fish and Wildlife Service right now on developing more habitat structures for mud puppies. Similar habitats can be incorporated into terrestrial ecosystems. This is a project we worked on in the top right-hand corner. Original design was for these pieces to be fit tight next to each other. We convinced our client at a massive cost savings to allow us to have more gaps in it. The resulting gaps provided small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates habitat that they would otherwise not have access to. The small mammals created burrows into that hillside, which had a southern exposure, creating an opportunity for a hibernaculum that was not originally designed for various species. In the bottom left-hand corner is a very simple concept where we just had rocks and logs that were placed, creating a shelter structure that ultimately served as a hibernaculum as well. Here's some other designs of hibernacula. This one, some of them can be highly engineered and incorporate concrete and plastic and tubes for snakes and animals to utilize. You can have it highly engineered and then very simplistic, with the bottom one having woody material and natural stone integrated into the design. And here you see one on the top that is more or less complete, and the one on the bottom is still in construction. Projects that are going to result in the loss of habitat, we advocate and do a lot of work doing rescue relocation, and this even includes restoration projects. If the loss of habitat is going to result in the loss of wildlife in the process of trying to improve the habitat, we advocate for professional rescue relocation, or what's called wildlife clearance efforts. We do a lot of work with various energy companies across Michigan. This last project we worked on over 2 years across several miles of area that we helped rescue and relocate animals. We saved over 12,000 amphibians and reptiles. A previous project we worked on, we rescued over 40,000 animals associated with that project. These sorts of efforts also are getting increased recognition by the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy as a way to combat some of the loss of wildlife on our landscapes. Here we had turtle eggs that were being recovered, adult snapping turtles, a ribbon snake. We also had 25 Blandings turtles that would have otherwise likely been killed on this project had we not gotten involved. Much of the stuff that I'm providing to you right now is also available on our website, and for a free download, you can get the Amphibian and Reptile Best Management Practices Manual. You can download that for free. We also have information about Michigan reptiles and amphibians under our My Species. We have been actively working on doing updates to all of our species, which we hope to get uploaded before spring, so stay tuned for that. We have our BMP manual on there, and also the HerpHat, which is a habitat assessment tool that we developed for EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which is similar to a floristic quality assessment or an IBI, an Index of Biological Integrity. We also are the coordinator and administrators for the state's Michigan Herp Atlas that documents amphibian and reptile records for all amphibians and reptiles across Michigan. The online data component of it has almost 34,500 records. We actually just had a person submit a record yesterday for mud puppies while they were ice fishing. We have interactive activity maps showing where and how many occurrence records we have by different counties. Northern Michigan is definitely an area where we have fewer records. Not only do we have this function, but if there's interest, I can share an app that we have been working on, Survey 123, where you can document amphibian and reptile records without having to formally develop an account. Or if you want, send me an email with your observations and we can submit those on your behalf. Why is this important? Why do we need this data? What kinds of data do we want? Well, we want all of it. Dead, alive, road mortality is hugely important. Michigan Department of Transportation has told us we will not do any extraordinary measures if we don't have documentation that rare species are on the landscape. It doesn't have to just be what you saw today, which I'd imagine is very little, but it can be from records from years past. We had a person who is in their 50s who on her 7th birthday found a blue racer, and she knows exactly where it was, and she had a photo of it. She shared it with us decades later. We're also not just interested in the rarest species. Many organizations just document rare species. We want to document all species, and it's critical. As a database specific for amphibians and reptiles, we have more luxury and ability to document everything. When you are trying to record all data, it becomes harder to record common species. So our database has all species. All seasons also. We sometimes get the craziest records of warm spells in February where an eastern garter snake is basking on top of snow. Photo documentation is always preferable. We have the online data entry as well as emails. As I said, feel free to send me an email if you have questions or want to contribute. How does this data get used? It's integrating this various data into analyses. It can be used for implementation of impact minimization. So if you know where you have wildlife, how does that affect the development that you're proposing? It can be used by organizations to help identify where's the highest quality habitats, determine potential impacts of wetlands. If this is a high quality wetland with a lot of observations, agencies can say, we really don't want you to negatively impact that. Or when you're doing restoration, you need to be very mindful of what chemicals you're using in these areas. It can be used to evaluate potential wetland mitigation or restoration sites as well. Where do we know historically a lot of diversity was present, and how do we help to get back to that point? Data is key for any effective conservation or management effort or plan. Integrating the data can be used to determine important ecological hotspots. So when we look across the state, where are our highest diversity areas when we look at what lands to protect and preserve? identifying locations of data gaps. Where do we need to start looking for species? Where do we not have a lot of data? And how can we start to evaluate population declines? It helps to evaluate responsive invasive species control. We've worked on several projects where integrating the amphibian and reptile diversity pre and post construction helps us to see where groups like Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy, their efforts to remove buckthorn in the nearshore habitats of this large wetland complex we're working with them on, prior to their amazing efforts and hard work to remove all those invasives, we now are seeing a response where amphibians and reptiles are using those areas that they actively restored. We've seen the same with spotted turtle use of areas that invasives have been removed from. It also provides innovative tools for assessing wetland condition and health, as we talked about with the HerpHat. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions. I'm happy to answer anything folks have.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, David. That was really interesting and really difficult to watch or look at photos of turtles struggling to cross the road.
It is.
It really pulls on your heartstrings. We do have a few questions if you have a minute.
Sure.
With some comments, some questions. Someone just said, who's responsible for posting the road signs alerting drivers to critters like turtle crossings? She thinks that's a great idea to add.
So that will be your local municipalities, your road commissions, MDOT. I can only do so much on my end. I eventually become, the old saying, the squeaky wheel. Well, I sometimes get replaced as the squeaky wheel. So it's more just not coming from me, but community members that say, I'm sick of seeing dead turtles. I'm sick of stopping at this spot. How do we remove the threats to these animals? And it's a small gesture, but it does make a difference. People will slow down, and not all, but those who do are enough, or at least alerting people that there are turtles present at that location. When people are slowing down or stopping, people more so understand that, okay, they're stopping because there must be a turtle present. So Department of Transportation, road commissions, those are going to be the first step, or your local municipality, educating them about why you would like to incorporate these signs. The seasonal signs we've seen run for about anywhere from 500 to 1500, and so there might be small grants that are available. The tricky part is to use bolts and lugs that someone is not going to steal them. So if you're near a university area, I wouldn't even bother. If you're extra rural, I would not even bother. If it's an area that has high traffic, that you're going to catch someone trying to steal the signs, because a cool turtle sign is going to get stolen. I've seen it happen. But
Yeah, in some 19-year-old's basement, right?
yeah.
Was where you'll
And
find them.
we don't
Uh,
do it with the idea of that expectation, but just being realistic that we don't want to keep redoing that if that's going to be a spot.
we do have a guest who's joining us from Indiana
Nice.
and was curious if there is an organization similar to yours in Indiana.
In Indiana, Ohio, I would say I know some folks. In Indiana, I have to say, the closest to what we do would be like Bruce Kingsbury's lab at Indiana Purdue. Him and Mark Jordan do some great work with conservation of amphibians and reptiles. Bruce developed a guideline for Midwest amphibians and reptiles that is really useful. It's more generalized than ours. It's big picture, conserve large tracts of land. We go through more of the details of doing that. They're writing it with a regional approach, so filling in gaps is harder to do that. And the organization he did it for was Midwest Park, which they use a geographic area that Midwest includes everywhere from Nebraska, Missouri to Michigan. So we don't. I prefer a Great Lakes focus, but Midwest in that organization has a larger area, so it's a little harder in that. But Bruce Kingsbury's lab would probably be the best place. I'm trying to blank on Nate's last name, but the herpetologist for Indiana would also be a good resource to reach out to.
Earlier, a little offline, we were talking a little bit about your views about protecting stable species
Mhm.
versus, or in addition to threatened species, I should say. Are there any species that you're particularly worried about?
There are. One in particular is American toads. They're a species, when we had that really cold snap in 2014, the populations crashed across much of Michigan. It was that same year we started getting numerous records of people observing eastern hognose snakes, which is a toad specialist. They feed on toads. We started noticing more observations because they were struggling finding food. So it's a trickle effect of some of these things that can happen. The toads were being impacted, thus the snakes are being impacted. I think those are one. The vernal pool dependent salamanders, marbled salamanders, they're obviously very rare, but species like blue spotted and spotted salamanders, the vernal pool associated and dependent species are just not getting the attention I think they need. When you tell folks that you need to protect 1,000 feet around a vernal pool's edge, that becomes very challenging. We struggle getting even agencies. The Department of Natural Resources struggles when they look at timber sales. How am I going to sell timber when you're telling me I need to save 1,000 feet around every one of these vernal pools that supports these species? It's not to say that the agencies won't do those things. It's how am I going to make these sorts of things happen, and what can we sacrifice? What's the compromise? And the reality is, as we talked about that shifting baseline, we have sacrificed already 100 plus years, 200 years of development, manipulation, and changes. We're now getting to a threshold of we're just running out of how much more can we push these organisms before we see true crashes. So those are two species. Sometimes things like spiny softshell turtles or snapping turtles, they folks feel like, oh, I see lots of snapping turtles, there's nothing to worry about. We still have a legal harvest of snapping turtles and spiny softshell turtles. The science has shown since the 1990s there is no sustainable harvest of snapping turtles. We cannot remove any snapping turtles from the population as adults without seeing an impact on the overall decline, and it'll result in a decline. Yet we still have a harvestable season. There are still grandfathered commercial harvesters of snapping turtles. Their licenses are not transferable, so as these individuals die off or no longer want to catch snapping turtles, then that ends. But we still have people who illegally collect snapping turtles during the nesting season. They're going after finding females crossing the roads and throw them in the back of the pickup truck. You are now, as I talked about, that's a 17-year minimum investment that turtle has on the landscape. They are the kidneys of our aquatic ecosystems. They're eating all the crap that no one else wants to eat. They're not only like a carp, they're a shelled carp, but they're also then eating the carp when we have these die-offs. They're feeding on all these organisms that others are not. So they're helping keep our aquatic landscapes clean. And when we're removing them from that landscape, from road mortality, a great example is Maple River State Game Area. That corridor along I-127, we had a massive number of animals that were killed this last year. And the agencies are working on resolving some of that, but it was something that was going on for weeks. And massive snapping turtles, ancient dinosaur snapping turtles, were killed on that road. And animals that live 50 to 70 years, when you have that large of an animal that is producing 50 to 100 eggs annually, those females are critical to those aquatic ecosystems. So snapping turtle is one of those species that I do worry about. And yes, we still see them. But again, when we think about the shifting baseline, would you have seen them in much higher numbers? The great example, we work with Fish and Wildlife Service quite a bit and collaborate with mud puppies. In the 1960s, when TFM, the compound used for lamprey control, first started getting used in the different techniques to control larval lamprey, the number of mud puppies that would die on those stretches of rivers was in the hundreds. If you go to those same spots now, and if I had not known that knowledge and I saw 2 or 3 mud puppies along a half-mile corridor, I would have thought that's incredible. This has a high density, a high number of mud puppies present. But understanding that along these reaches of river in northern Michigan, you may have seen hundreds of mud puppies just 5 or 6 decades ago. It helps to give that context of, okay, what we have now still needs to be monitored. And I will say, to the credit of the agencies, they have worked diligently to better understand how to best manage those aquatic ecosystems to minimize the impacts. I know firsthand, some of the biologists there, if a mud puppy is negatively impacted by the compounds, they are immediately taken out of the water, flushed to get all of those contaminants off of them. So there is that shift also, not just the shifting baseline of what is our knowledge, but a shift in how we manage. I was once told in a meeting, we don't need your kind of work. We kill hundreds of them every year, and there's always more next year. That mindset doesn't exist anymore, and those sorts of people have thankfully retired out of these organizations, and that archaic mindset of we have plenty, so don't worry about it, is definitely disappearing, and more people are recognizing how important it is to work collaboratively and to conserve not just our rarest species. I'm all for protecting our rarest mussels and saving the sturgeon, but also think about these quiet organisms who have been consistent on the landscape that you just don't see as much anymore. And I'm sure if you ask some of the people listening to the presentation, older participants, yeah, I used to see that species all the time. Or when I'd go out ice fishing, I'd get that all the time, Saginaw Bay. We used to see back in the 80s, Dave, I'd go out with my grandfather, people in their 40s, I'd go out with my grandfather and we'd find mud puppies on the Saginaw Bay all the time. I've gone out fishing there since, my grandpa passed away. I haven't found one in 30 years. And then you look at the dioxins and different contaminants, algal blooms, you have the amount of Phragmites in these systems, the nutrient inputs, and these animals are quietly disappearing. And so in another 20 years, are we going to say, well, no, they don't occur in that geographic area? And the assumption is that they hadn't been there because we didn't have baseline data to compare it to, versus we knew they were there, they've disappeared. How do we change that?
David, as we roll into, and our next lecture is about road salt, and as we roll into Salt Week this week, I'm curious. I know we talked a little bit beforehand as well. Your thoughts on the impact of road salt on these species?
Mm-hmm. So, especially in these riparian areas, and I mentioned in the presentation how you can have those swales to help mitigate some of the salt inputs. Some communities in West Michigan I know will incorporate sand salt mixtures to reduce the amount of sodium sodium chloride going into our aquatic ecosystems. I know beet juice has been incorporated and tried in places. I think that is more of an aesthetic problem, and I think it also it might be a little sticky because of the sugars. So there's opportunities to find solutions. I think it's scalability. No one wants to get into a car accident. No one wants someone to die as a result of this. I have a family. I don't want my mom or my stepkids on the road, slipping and sliding. It's how do we balance amount and volume, and I think we all can see those frustrations of when it's really salt or snowy out and icy, the trucks aren't out there. And then when it's a powdering of snow, you can hear the gravel of salt underneath your vehicle. So it's working with the road commissions to understand where their limitations are. We can attack these organizations, but we have to know what logistics they have, challenges of timing these things. And yeah, well, we anticipated conditions to be so much harder. Climate variability makes things so much more difficult. But overall, higher salinity does result in developmental problems for amphibians. The higher salinity of water will also affect the freezing point of water. So you no longer get, I'm sure folks have seen signs that says caution, no skating, thin ice. It's because all the salts that are going into those detention ponds or aquatic habitats, the amount of salinity that's present in there reduces the freezing point, so you get thinner ice that people will fall through. Well, that thinner ice and colder conditions can also affect animals living within that ecosystem over winter. They may get colder than is there within their tolerances for overwintering. So there are concerns with salt on the landscape. I don't have the answers on that. I would love to see more alternatives used where we can, and maintaining bioswales and features. I know out in, I can't remember if it was Minnesota or Wisconsin, sometimes they will even, especially associated with the river systems, they have these like massive heaters that they will then, as they consolidate the snow, they just superheated, blow torches that melts all the snow, goes into the river, and then can refreeze or whatever it's going to do. So they're it's a trade-off. You're now using hydrocarbons instead of salt. But if we can find, where's that balance point? Because if our rivers are saline and it's a wood turtle river, you're losing your trout fishing, you're losing your wood turtles. Is it better to use some propane and mitigate that, or is the trade-off of the CO2 output too excessive? I don't have the answers. It's one of those things that I'm glad you have someone presenting on it and giving people an opportunity to think about these problems, because we don't live in a vacuum, and that's always the challenge of it, is we have such dynamic conditions and strong viewpoints of what our goals and objectives are. It's at the end of the day, I think we all want to do what's best for each other and ourselves, and also the landscape. It's just there's not just a push this button and all the problems are solved.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance,
Yes.
David. Lots of comments just thanking you and telling you they have so much more appreciation for these species after your talk. I did have a question real quick. I before we close out, someone has a pair of snapping turtles on a pond behind their house. Anything they need to fear?
Losing them.
Losing them.
So
What do they eat? Can they feed them?
um legally, I can't answer that question. But so, what are you going to feed them, right? So we had a person in Canada, they had a turtle in their pond called T-Rex. And there's just this ancient snapping turtle. They would throw it granola bars. Please don't feed it granola bars. It's going to eat it. But if you have some turtles and it makes you happy, one, please consider posting it and sharing your observations with the Herp Atlas. But if you were fishing and you have the carcass of your fish, throwing it into the snapping turtles, you're putting it back into the ecosystem. You get to enjoy wonderful snapping turtles. If you have them, I also encourage creating nesting area on your property, so that you not only are having these 2 snapping turtles, but then you can make your neighbors really upset when their 2 becomes 20 and your 20 becomes 60, and you're not there anymore to worry about it, and you can just die happily knowing that there are more turtles in this world than it started with, and that's thanks to you. And that's what my philosophy in life is I want to make the right people happy and the wrong people angry, because of the work I do has more animals in it than not.
Yeah, I was thinking about putting in a rock wall for the snakes, but I'm not sure if my neighbors would like that either. So I just want to thank you again for giving us your time and your expertise today. I'm going to quickly share my closing screen as we say goodbye. And if anyone has any questions for David that we weren't able to answer here today, his email is on the screen. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I hope you can all see my shared screen now. And again, I just want to thank David for his time. Before we wrap up, I want to remind you to save the dates for our next icebreakers on February 25th and March 25th, where we'll explore topics like road salt and climate change. We'll also have a few exciting opportunities coming up. Our Watershed Educators Training is a 2-day workshop for free for educators on February 27th and 28th. It's open to educators in our service area, and will provide training in incorporating watershed education into classrooms and providing funding to implement those practices in schools. Our Greenbelt Cost Share Program, if you're a part of the Burt Lake Watershed, you can apply for up to $2,000 in assistance to establish natural shorelines on your property. And of course, your support makes our work possible, whether through volunteering or through a membership. We'd love to have you involved. You can join online or give us a call. And thank you again, David, for an engaging presentation. And thank you all for joining us. And I hope to see you on February 25th. Don't forget, you can also watch it in person at the Community Foundation. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on February 25th.
Take care.
Thanks, David.